Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Nigel Jones. I live in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I'm a retired surgeon, worked for 22 years at the Freeman Hospital here. You'll note that I've tweaked my title by adding in the words "and practice." So because obviously you're going to study medicine and hopefully then we're going to practice it. So how does a Christian worldview impact on the study and practice of medicine? This is the outline of my talk. I'm going to define what I mean by a Christian worldview. I'm going to ask an important question, which I really want you to think about, and that is, why did Jesus get so involved with human disease? We'll look fleetingly at Jesus, the great physician, our role model. I'll talk about medical ethics teaching here in Newcastle upon Tyne, which I've been involved with for the last 10 years. We'll then move to consider history, and 2,500 years ago when Hippocrates came along and contended with the ethics of his day. We'll look at the 20th century and what happened in Nazi Germany. And then we'll consider, well, in the face of all these difficulties, how do we teach medical ethics today and the so-called 4 ethical principles? And finally, I want to, in my last 2 slides, refer to a famous Christian 17th century physician, Thomas Sydenham, sometimes known as the English Hippocrates. It's important to recognize, as Andy's been saying, that every individual has a worldview. That's a set of presuppositions or beliefs that inform our actions and decisions and make sense of the world around us. But a Christian worldview, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I believe that the primary reason for my existence and your existence is the creative act of Almighty God, and particularly who made me in his own image. This is the basis and the establishment of the principle of the sanctity of human life that we're going to refer to a lot in this talk. My worldview also understands from his word, the Bible, which is my source of infallible and absolute truth. It understands that he's given us commandments to live by. And these commandments, if you read them, are absolute. They're not relative. For example, the commandment, do not murder, in Exodus 20:13. I also learned something important, and that is that God wants me to be a member of his family. See, when he made Adam and Eve, he made them as his children. He wants me to be a member of his family, the church, and to love him, to obey him, and to serve him. I want to show you then how this Christian worldview impacts on the study and practice of medicine by asking this question: why did Jesus get so involved with disease and suffering? We can call that the practice of medicine. Jesus' practice of medicine. Did Jesus do it out of compassion? Was he going out of his way to prove that he was God? Or was there a greater reason? I suggest to you there was. And the answer lies in our understanding of what happened in the fall of Adam and Eve. I've called this the cosmic effect of the fall. And then to understand what is the cosmic effect of Christ's redemption. So let's look at the cosmic effect of the fall. Romans chapter 5 is a very important book in the Bible. Adam and Eve disobeyed God in Eden, and because of their sin, they and all mankind fell. This verse, Romans 5:12, has already been quoted in Andy's presentation. So my Christian worldview tells me 3 things entered our world that day in history. Death entered, of man and all creatures. Disease entered, for example, aging, infections, cancer, and decay entered, of our creation, of earthquakes, of thistles and thorns. So the biblical record in Genesis 1-3 and Romans 5 make it absolutely clear that death did not exist before the fall. Romans 5 is being quoted to prove that. If you're concerned about the issue of plant death, which obviously man and the animals were eating at that time, understand that that's different. And you can read about that. It's helpfully dealt with by Philip Bell in his book, Evolution and the Christian Faith, published by Day One, page 190. So that's the cosmic effect of the fall. What about the cosmic effect of Christ's redemption in reversing these issues 1, 2, and 3? First, death. In Romans 5, we read again that through the obedience of the one man, Jesus Christ, many will be made righteous. Our sin was atoned for by his physical death. What else do we learn about what Jesus did about death? Well, we read in Hebrews that the power and fear of death, which is held by Satan, was abolished. You don't need to fear it if you come to Christ. And in Revelation chapter 21, we read that in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no more death. So death has been dealt with by Christ's redemption. What about disease? Well, in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, and in chapters on either side of it, we see Jesus dealing with disease in a big way. And we read these words, that Jesus bore our diseases. The same quote comes from Isaiah 53, verse 4. Our diseases and our pain were dealt with by Christ. And we mustn't overlook that. We tend to think of Jesus dealing with sin and death and creation in Romans 8, which I'm coming to. But he bore our diseases. He died to deal with disease. And the third issue, that of decay, the decay of the creation. Romans 8:21 tells us that through the death of Christ, creation will be liberated from its bondage to decay. So Christ died to abolish death, disease, and decay. However, as we've already heard, some theistic evolutionists argue that Adam and Eve only died spiritually. They believe that physical death existed before Adam and Eve in their long ages evolution model. It makes a complete mockery of Christ having to die physically upon the cross. Aging, you see, is a degenerative disease leading to inevitable death. And when God said to Adam and Eve, if you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall surely die, that was a death sentence if they took it. And that physical death sentence was passed on Adam and Eve. Can I commend these two resources to you? Stephen Lloyd will speak later, and I'll give an early plug of his booklet, which is brilliant. Adam and Eve, Adam or Death rather, which came first, available from Biblical Creation Trust. And the other resource, which I strongly recommend, is a DVD by Martin Williams. He teaches theology in Melbourne. This DVD, Which Gospel, available from CMIS, particularly the bonus talk, Creation as a Secondary Issue, which deals with death, disease, and decay very helpfully. So we're considering the study and practice of medicine. And I again want to emphasize that disease was no secondary issue for Jesus. You remember when John the Baptist sent his disciples to Jesus to say, are you the one who is to come? What proof did Jesus send back to John? Let's read in Luke chapter 7, verse 21. At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and he gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. These words of Jesus are quoting Isaiah chapter 35, verse 5 to 6. They are the job description of the Messiah, the great physician. He came to deal with disease. Now, when we consider the study of medicine, we're not just dealing with medical students, people going to study medicine. I went to do that in 1966, a long time ago. But dental students, nursing and midwifery students, physiotherapy students, occupational therapy students, speech and language therapy students. And in Christian unions, you can be brought together. I first heard the gospel in the Christian Union at Guy's Hospital and was converted the following year. Yes, as Andy has said, there's going to be difficulties, there's going to be different opinions, but we're supposed to be salt and light. So as long as you fellowship with those that are like-minded about these issues, be salt and be light in the Christian unions or in Christian medical fellowship groups. I'm now just going to move to 2 slides about the Lord Jesus Christ. I've said that disease was a big issue for Jesus. And I'm not going to read all this passage of scripture from Mark's gospel, but I want to draw your attention to Jesus's local surgery as described here. I want you to go and look at the last verse. How did Jesus start his day? Very early in the morning, while it was dark, he got up, left the house, and prayed. Jesus prepared for his day by meeting his Father in prayer. Quiet time and prayer, so important. Before you go out to meet people and deal with them, it's a good thing to talk to God about them. You may have fears about the operation you're going to do that day, or the clinic that you're going to do for the first time. Talk to the Father. Let's go back to the beginning. The record here is that they were together in the synagogue, and after the synagogue, as we do, they went for hospitality to the house of Simon and Andrew. And Simon, that's Peter's mother-in-law, was in bed with fever, and Jesus immediately cured her and helped her up. Note, on the Lord's Day. And what about the rest of the day? Well, the day was full of Jesus running his surgery, dealing with those that were physically and mentally ill, until well after sunset. So if we could summarize on this slide, he prepared in prayer. His surgery open times were all day. Now about the issue of the Sabbath, obviously in a caring profession, whether that be in a care home or in care home in medicine, the Lord's Day can be just like any other day. There are people that have to be looked after. So if I was on surgical call for emergencies, I would have to do emergency operations. I would have to do reward rounds on the Lord's Day in the morning for the people that I was responsible for. I've called this the donkey in the pit principle, or works of necessity. But the Lord's Day is going to be very important to you as students. Be a twicer and devote it to God. You'll never do badly in exams because you haven't worked on the Lord's Day. The surgery open times were from early morning to even early night, or even after sunset. No appointment needed. All the pound came. In these modern times, who was paying for all this? Nobody. He prayed. It was his power. And what were the results? He healed many of physical and mental disease. Moving on to the subjects that you will perhaps meet and tussle with if you're studying in medical ethics issues, which I've done for the last 10 years by invitation. Incidentally, when I went to meet the man who organizes it, he never asked me for my worldview. So get in there, chaps. Some of the issues: confidentiality. We don't share the patient's secrets with Joe Public. Duty of candor. That means telling the truth, particularly when we make mistakes. The impaired newborn with Down syndrome, spina bifida, etc. Genetics. Prenatal testing, which is intimately linked with abortion, of course. The use of human tissues, such as organs in transplantation or of embryos. End-of-life issues. How we deal with confidentiality issues in HIV patients. The immunization of the young against cancer of the cervix. The definitions of brainstem death and persistent vegetative state, which are so important in organ transplantation. Abortion and domestic violence. Now, I'm just going to highlight 2 cases, real cases, of dealing with the impaired newborn. And I'm going to do this to show you the impact of believing or not believing in the sanctity of human life. These are real cases, and we study these in our ethics teaching. The first case is that where a pediatrician, Dr. Leonard Arthur, met a little newborn baby called John Pearson in June 1980. John had Down syndrome. And when Dr. Arthur interviewed his parents, they said they didn't want him to survive. So he wrote this in the notes, and he wrote nursing care only. But he then prescribed dihydrocodone 4 hourly as required. This is a painkiller. Did John Pearson have pain? No, he's just hungry like any other baby. But the drug sedated him, so he didn't cry for food, and he died 3 days later of pneumonia. Somebody reported this to the authorities, and he was charged with murder. Now, strangely, after a post-mortem which showed that John Pearson had some heart, lung, and brain abnormalities, which are sometimes found in Downs, his charge was reduced to attempted murder, fairly illogical. The trial took place over a year later, in November 81. At that trial, he was defended by a QC, George Carman, who advised Dr. Arthur not to give evidence in his own trial. In his closing speech, Carman said these words: "He could, like Pontius Pilate, have washed his hands of the matter. He did not, because good doctors don't turn away. Are we to condemn him as a criminal because he helped two people, the mother and the child, at the time of their greatest need? Are we to condemn a doctor because he cared?" I ask you the obvious question: did he care for the child? A medical expert, distinguished medical expert at that time, the president of the Royal College of Physicians, Sir Douglas Black, said this in his defense: "I say it is ethical in the case of a child suffering from Downs and with a parental wish that it should not survive, to terminate life, providing other considerations are taken into account, such as the status and ability of the parents to cope in a way that the child could otherwise have had a happy life." The jury took 2 hours to find Dr. Arthur not guilty. Now, Dr. Arthur sadly died in 1983, and in 1985 an article appeared criticizing the judge's summing up in that trial. Dr. Arthur had actually admitted to the police that the effect of the sedative drug given was to stop the child seeking sustenance, which is what he intended. The judge, who knew this, made no mention of this potential homicidal intent during the summing up. You see, Dr. Arthur's utmost respect for John Pearson's problem and having Down syndrome meant ending his life, and this conflicts with the principle of the sanctity of human life. 3 months before Dr. Arthur's trial, another child with Down syndrome was born. This little girl has been known as Baby B. She not only had Down syndrome, but she was suffering from intestinal obstruction, and her parents believed it was unkind to operate on her and that she should be let to die with sedatives. But the doctors caring for Baby B believed this was wrong and asked the local authority to make her a ward of court. That's what happens when there's a conflict between the doctors and the parents in what should be done with a child. The child, the judge and the court actually ruled that the child should be operated on. Now, the parental rights are removed when the child becomes the ward of court. The courts have the rights. But when the surgeon learned that the parents were refusing consent, he thought he should not operate on the child, so the matter went back to court. The same judge now ruled that this surgeon should not be made to operate on the child. But the local authority were confident that this child could be adopted if a successful operation took place. So they took the matter to a higher court. And in that higher court, Lord Justice Templeman and Lord Justice Dunn both ruled that the baby should have the operation to relieve her intestinal obstruction. 2 other surgeons had agreed to do this. Lord Justice Templeman, in summing up, said, "The choice lies between allowing an operation which may result in the child living for 20 or 30 years. Today, the prognosis for Down syndrome is 60 years, or terminating the life of a Down syndrome child because she has an intestinal complaint. Faced with that choice, I have no doubt that it is the duty of this court to decide the child must live." Lord Justice Dunn agreed. Moving back into history, 2,500 years. It's important to understand the impact of Hippocrates on Western medicine in the last 2,500 years. Hippocrates said this: "I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but I will never use it to injure or wrong them. I will not give poison to anyone." This ethical legacy led to the sanctity of human life being a foundational principle of Western and Islamic medicine for over 2,000 years. You see, Hippocrates and his followers at that time were unhappy with contemporary medicine, and they defined clear standards for their medical practice in their oath, which had 4 elements. What were the ethical views at the time of Hippocrates? Well, you've heard of Plato and you've heard of Aristotle, much quoted. Plato said this: a woman over 40 should have an abortion if she's pregnant. Infanticide is essential to maintain the quality of the citizens. Aristotle later said infanticide and abortion should be used if there's an excess number of children in the family. And exposure, that means the practice of leaving the children out in the elements to die, should be compulsory for any deformed baby. Interestingly, a historian 200 years before Christ, Polybius, said that abortion and infanticide had been the cause of serious depopulation of Greece and the cause of its military decline. So what of this oath? The oath, first of all, had a vertical element. The physician would swear by the gods of medicine to practice medicine according to this oath. Now you say to me, well, we don't believe in gods with a little g, but that's who they believed in that time, and they invested in them the authority to watch over them and see that they did right things. So Apollo, Aesculapius, Hygeia, and Panacea would later be displaced by the God of the Bible. We had horizontal duties to the teacher and to the patient. The teacher would be regarded as the same way as I do my parents. And I would teach what is taught to me to my sons, to the sons of my teachers, and to other pupils who've signed the oath and sworn obedience to the physician's law, but to nobody else. What about duties to patients? I've underlined never, not, not. These are all absolutes that the physician vowed to. He would never injure or wrong a patient. He would never give poison to anyone, euthanasia-assisted suicide. He would never give a pessary to a woman to cause an abortion. And then there were some extra little details which you might find strange, but he took an oath not to cut for bladder stone. That's an operation to deal with that problem which was endemic at that time. That should be left to surgeons who trained. It's an important principle. You don't work outside your area of expertise. There should be no sexual impropriety with patients, and you should keep your patients' confidences. Note, these are all absolutes. And finally, the sanction. If I keep this oath, may I enjoy honor in my life and among all men. But if I break it, if I transgress it, may the opposite befall me. Now you will notice in this oath, there is nothing about the relief of suffering. It is, of course, a duty of a doctor to relieve suffering, but suffering is a relative issue. It cannot be held as the primary matter at the top of the apex. That has to be held by the sanctity of human life. The oath made to these pagan gods was Christianized very soon. So Luke would have been a Hippocratic physician. He was a Greek-trained physician. And here's an illustration from a Byzantine document of the oath written in the form of a cross in the 12th century. What changed? Well, in the middle of the 20th century, when people were beginning to dismiss God from their thinking and from their ethics, a professor of law and of psychiatry in Germany wrote a very influential book, 1920. It's called The Freedom to Destroy Lives Not Worth Living. This principle of lives not worth living is something much talked about these days. Just read how they described people. People living who were brain damaged, mentally retarded, psychiatrically ill, as human ballast and human husks, and said their destruction was not only tolerable, but downright humane. This book had a profound effect on medical and social attitudes and the rise of the Nazi Party. Doctors in Germany were complicit in many atrocities. So after the war, after the Nuremberg trials, the World Medical Association endeavored to re-establish Hippocratic medicine. But they failed in the regard that they did not have a vertical reference to God. And they stated in this in 1948, in their first attempt at it, the utmost respect for human life from the time of conception. Utmost respect is not an absolute, I will not give poison. Time of conception, well, that was good. However, it's been amended multiple times. And very quickly, time of conception was removed and changed to from the beginning. And then in 2006, any reference to the unborn life was removed completely. So an ethical absolute, as we would have from the Bible, was destroyed. And anybody can define their own beginning. So this would allow abortion and using the human embryo in every way they want. So how do we teach ethics in medical school in the face of these difficulties? Well, we often refer to this book, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics, written by Beauchamp and Childress in 1985. There are 4 ethical principles: respect for autonomy, beneficence, which means do good, non-maleficence, do no harm, and justice. It's a useful place to start. But what people try and do is drop the last 3 of them and just deal with personal autonomy. So the editor of the British Medical Journal, strangely called Fiona Godley, says that personal autonomy is the cardinal principle of medical ethics. So they and the BMJ back euthanasia, suicide, abortion. She is profoundly wrong. See, autonomous, autonomy, comes from 2 Greek words, self, law. I want to choose. That's right, you can refuse treatment. But who chooses? The pregnant woman wanting an abortion or her unborn child? The demented old person or the relatives? Child with Down syndrome or a family? The patient or the society who has to pay the bill? Thomas Sydenham was a 17th century Christian physician, and he said to physicians in his 3rd ethical advice, let the physician reflect that he has undertaken the care of no mean creature, for in order that he, the doctor, may estimate the value, the greatness of the human race, the only begotten Son of God became himself a man, and thus ennobled it with his divine dignity, and far more than this, he died to redeem it. Our mandate and our rock that we should practice our medicine on is the sanctity of human life, found there in Genesis 1:27. And if you think of ethical issues, the day that Jesus entered Mary's womb was a very significant day. The sanctity of human life was wonderfully displayed. Thank you. Any questions?